But I'll tell you what we're going to do now. We're going to go down to Wales because Jamie Jenkins is here, independent statistician, political commentator, of course. Jamie, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Now, what's going on in Wales? Mr. Drakeford appears to have thrown the cat out the window and decided that the bath towel's going with it and everything else. What's happening?
Yeah, so we've got these COVID passes in Wales. So they're slightly different to COVID passports overall, where you can get a lateral flow test, and they've been in kind of venues, big stadiums. I think the rugby's been in recently, and then you got nightclubs, similar to what you kind of got up in Scotland. And what Mark Drakeford said a few weeks ago is that if you actually, if we don't see cases coming down, we're going to look to extend them. Now, in cases in Wales, have actually been coming down over the last few weeks, and in England, to point that out as well, Mike. We've had the longest decline in cases across England and Wales since the summer.
Right.
But they had a vote in the Senedd yesterday to look to extend these now into theatres, into cinemas. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of an antidote on this one, Mike. That my 8-year-old boy, actually, 12 people in his class have got COVID.
Right.
So he tested positive for it over the weekend. I had to have a test yesterday to release myself because they changed the rules in Wales. You've got to have a negative PCR test. And I actually tested positive, come back this morning saying I've tested positive. But I have very few symptoms at all, Mike. A little bit of a headache, but I got no loss of smell, no high temperature, no cough.
Right.
But I have been double jabbed, Mike, so I could get a COVID pass. I haven't needed to get a COVID pass, so I haven't actually got one. But I could go to all these venues. If my son hadn't tested positive because of lots of people in his class had got COVID, I could be out spreading the virus myself.
But that's the point. The whole idea of the vaccine passport or vaccine pass, whatever you want to call it, is nonsensical. In the same way that making people get double jabbed doesn't make any sense either, because if they didn't want to do it in the first place, why would they suddenly do it now? And as we know, it doesn't actually change the transmissibility, if you like, of COVID.
No, I think the important thing really, Mike, is that, and this is for the NHS staff, obviously, where they're trying to mandate these vaccines. On that, an interesting statistic, obviously, COVID is kind of a deadly virus for a lot of people, but it's generally the elderly that it does kill. If you are looking at the stats yesterday, Mike, and if you look at the flu vaccine last winter, only 77% of NHS frontline staff had the flu vaccine. And, you know, the flu is a deadly virus as well. But going back to these kind of vaccine passports, what the problem with them is, Mike, is that people who've had a prior infection, and there'd be huge amounts of NHS and care staff who've had a prior infection. The ONS have done some research and study and some analysis themselves to show that the chances of you catching COVID are significantly reduced if you've had a prior infection. But none of the ministers, none of the policies are thinking about all of that.
No.
There's millions of people who've had COVID, Mike, and saying that you have to have a jab. I say I'm double jabbed, but it's not for me to tell anybody if they should have a vaccine or not. And mandating vaccines when we've never done that in the past for the likes of flu, which is a deadly respiratory virus for many, just seems a bit too far for me, Mike.
Well, that's right. And I mean, the thing is, we've got statistics on pretty much everything. I saw that you were having a go at some of the reporting deaths soaring to 262 on a Tuesday compared to Monday, because quite frankly, everybody who's anybody knows that Tuesday's figure is always higher than Monday's because of the weekend collection and all of that. But also, they do collect evidence and data on everything, but they don't collect it, or they certainly haven't shared it with us, on herd immunity.
No, I think I knew a few months back, or maybe a few weeks back, Mike, they were saying they run out of these test tubes to do some tests across the NHS.
And
then ultimately,
what, a shortage of test tubes? Surely not.
Well, yeah, we have to put that one in your shortage of the week, Mike, or something. But we had a shortage of test tubes because why not offer antibody tests for people who've had kind of prior infection? And that's why I was always critical about vaccinating children as well. So my boy, obviously, he's 8 now. He's downstairs at the moment, Mike. He's playing on his computer. He's out, all his mates, 11 of them, are all kind of on their headsets, loving the fact that they're all off school, and he hasn't got any, coughing or anything. Right. He's just having a whale of a time. So I think kind of when we're looking at all of this in the grand scheme of the day, Mike, the other day as well, you had the NHS boss kind of saying that the number of people going into hospital was 14 times higher than this time last year. Absolute nonsense.
Well, it was rubbish. Well, she's like, you'll be pleased to know she made herself onto the plank of the week list for that.
No, good, Mike. Because for me, there's a bit about, some people might say, oh, she was deliberately trying to be misleading to try and scare people to go and get a booster jab. But it's just the kind of the smell test with that number. It's no rocket science. If you're the head of the NHS, you should have some nous with a bit of data to know the fact that.
I mean, Ian Collins said to me the other day, if you'd done the maths on that, it would mean that 154,000 people were in hospital. And you go, exactly, well, that's just ridiculous. And anyone looking at that, if they were in a PR department of the NHS, would have said, well, that must be wrong.
Exactly that, Mike. And just for the listeners and the viewers, this actually, rather than being 14 times higher at the moment, if you actually look at the numbers, they're a third lower. And say cases are coming down now. The interesting thing here, Mike, is they started looking like they peaked before half term, and schools have actually gone back. And we're not seeing this big spike. And the interesting thing is that we say we've had 14 days now of consecutive declines, which is the longest period now since the summer, which is an important part of all of this. And ironically, even though Scotland do have lower rates overall, if you start tracking over the last few weeks in terms of where the growth in cases are, it's in Scotland. And what we got in Scotland, Mike, we got vaccine passports, we got masks. England's got the biggest decline in cases. Scotland's got the biggest increase in cases. None of this is making much sense at all anymore.
Well, none of it is at all. And of course, now, just to add sort of fuel to the fire, Patrick Vallance, one of the government's scientific advisors, has come out and said that climate change is going to be worse than COVID. So presumably that means we can forget about COVID then, can we?
Well, Mike, this whole climate change thing is, we can't deny this. We're going to do our bit for the planet. But for me,
I can't even see the planet out the window today. That's how bad it is.
Well, they probably say it's all the emissions from all the cars, Mike. And although I think in London you don't get many cars because they've got all the cycle lanes.
Yeah, you can't go anywhere in a car at this moment in time in London. You can just sit in it and leave the engine running, unless you've got one of those economic ones, ergonomic ones, where the engine cuts out.
That, Mike. No, exactly that. And I think that the problem you got obviously now is that we're coming out the back end of COVID. Hopefully, the case is actually going rife in Europe. Only a few weeks ago, Mike, everybody was saying how bad the UK is. Obviously, we're testing significantly more than the rest of Europe. But they got a fourth wave in Germany and Russia. Things have gone kind of off the scale. It's probably an element there, Mike, because obviously vaccines are in some of these countries that ultimately to get out of this, everybody's going to need to catch the virus. As I've had 2 jabs where I've caught the virus now, and obviously I won't come back with too many symptoms. But ultimately, Mike, that's what we're going to need. And maybe now the kind of the scientists are starting to move on to the climate change agenda as the next thing to start scaring us, because you can't tell me, Mike, that it all starts with some kind of leadership here. If Boris Johnson's going to start flying back and forth Scotland, and I think Prince Charles, Mike, I was going to do the maths on this, but I haven't got around to doing it. I think Prince Charles's climate kind of CO2 emissions in the last month's probably been more than my lifetime when he's flying around in the world.
Well,
so,
I mean,
I'm going to bank in what Prince Charles has done.
COP26 is going to create more carbon emissions than the entire nation of Scotland in a year, right? So that's what their hypocrisy is doing. But what about this business at the end of the day of why we are still in the position that we are in, despite the fact that more or less a lot of life has pretty much returned to normal. I'm finding a lot of people now are getting COVID after the fact, and some of those people are getting it because they had their second jab, say 5 or 6 months ago, which suggests anyway that the jab does wear off. In which case people might say, well, I wish I'd never bothered getting it.
Yeah, well, obviously we're coming through and learning a lot about all of this. I think my jab was probably about 4, 5, 6 months ago, and I think ultimately what we're going to probably need to come up with all of this is I put a tweet out yesterday to just continue to look at the death statistics on all of this, and it's still a virus that's more deadly for the elderly. We've got the vast majority of all of the deaths, 90% of all the deaths in the past month, the people over the age of 60, nearly 3/4 of the age of 75, despite the majority of these people being vaccinated. Now, the deaths, let's not kind of shy away from the previous waves. Deaths are considerably lower because the vaccine will be having an effect. But I think longer term, Mike, vaccinating the whole population, and there was talk about you can't travel if you haven't had a third booster. They're going to roll that out to the whole population. I think, Mike, we're just going to learn to kind of, where you have a flu vaccine for the JCVI vulnerable groups, you'll have a COVID vaccine. Vaccinating the whole population isn't the way out of all of this in the longer term, and further jabs. Prior infection over time, you look back 100 years ago, Mike, with the Spanish flu, you had the first wave, you had a second wave, you had an next wave. But over time, these waves kind of diminish because you tend to find the viruses become more transmissible but less deadly. So I think vaccination in the longer term isn't going to be the solution to all of this. It's probably just going to be kind of the word herd immunity in the end.
People actually getting it. Jamie, great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed. Jamie Jenkins, independent statistician and political commentator on the latest COVID stats, which are very, very encouraging if you want to see the end of this, because it would suggest that they are at their lowest level for quite some time and they're going down continually. So all this talk of, cancelling Christmas if you don't get the booster jab, I think they're not going to go near that if they've got any brains.